Hello there, this is Josh with Court Reserve, and this video is going to go over how you can set up guest waiver kiosks, how you can push guest waivers from the front desk waiver URL, and also how you can get reporting on your guest waivers. So first, I'll go over how to set up a guest waiver kiosk. If you need to add a new waiver into the system, maybe you have a guest waiver that is different from the general liability waiver you have for members, we can always start that off by going to settings on the sidebar, scrolling down to the reservation settings row, and going to the waivers and agreements page. From this page, if you need to add or create a new waiver in the system, this is going to be where we can add that new guest waiver. Or if you are going to be using that same general liability waiver, that will not be necessary. But once we have the waiver added into the system, we can go back to settings on the sidebar, and we'll want to go to organization settings and the kiosks page. From here, we can edit a kiosk that we already have created, or we can create a new kiosk here. And when we go to create or edit a kiosk, the guest waivers option is going to be under the kiosk feature section right here. So I'll fill in my name really quick for the kiosk, and I'll also fill in the PIN code. And then once we start setting up the guest waivers feature on the kiosk, the first thing that we will need to do is add the applicable waivers to this kiosk. So this is where we decide which waivers will need to be signed whenever a guest is going through this kiosk here. If we need to add multiple waivers, we can always do that. And then next, we will need to set up the guest form that will need to be filled out when the waivers are getting signed by guests. This is going to look pretty similar to the sign-up form that organizations have for members. So here we will be able to include the fields that we'd like to add to the guest form, and we can also require them if we would like to. There is also the option to add custom fields to the guest form if there's any additional information that you would like the guest to fill out while they're filling out the form. So, for example, if you would like to get emergency contact information for each guest that is entering your facility, we can create a new custom field. Or if you already have an emergency contact custom field created, we can go to the All Custom Fields table, and we can add that to the guest form. Once we have everything set up for the guest waiver kiosk, we will just need to click Save Changes. And now we will have that kiosk created in the system. So to open this kiosk, we can copy the URL here. And once we paste that URL, we will now be in that kiosk. It is important to remember that you cannot be signed into the admin side of Court Reserve and a kiosk at the same time. So you will need a separate computer or tablet to run this kiosk. Once we are in the kiosk, in order to sign into it, we will need to fill in the PIN code. And then from there, we can start the kiosk. So if a guest enters the facility, they can walk up to the kiosk here and they can click on the guest waivers option. From here, they will need to fill in any fields that you required on the guest form. And with the additional fields, they can fill it in if they would like to. From there, any waivers that you have added to the guest waiver kiosk will show below. And if there's more than one, both of those waivers will show down here. And from here, the guest will just need to click this section to sign, add their signature. And once all the fields are filled out, I'll fill them out really quickly. We can hit save. And then from there, the guest waiver will be saved and a new blank one will fill up for the next guest that enters your facility. So let me jump back over to the admin side of Court Reserve and also show you how you can push guest waivers from the front desk waiver URL. All right, to access the front desk waiver URL, we will want to go to settings on the sidebar. And if we go to reservation settings, we are going to want to go to the waivers and agreements page. If we go over to the additional settings tab, there is going to be a setting one to allow signing at the front desk. If we check that, you will then get the front desk signing URL, and we will also need to enable allow guest waiver signing at front desk. Once we enable that, we will get to decide which kiosk setup we would like to put in the front desk URL. So once I add the guest waiver kiosk, it's going to look at all of the included and required fields that I have on the guest form for this specific kiosk, and it's going to push those same fields onto the front desk URL. So once I hit save changes on the additional settings page, we can go to the front desk URL, and here you are going to see a guest waivers button on this page. When we click on that button, we are going to see that same guest form that we had filled out on that kiosk. And with that, we are going to see all of the different waivers that we had also included on that kiosk setup. So now that we have gone over the different ways that guests can sign waivers at your organization, I will now go over guest waiver reporting in the system. And there's going to be two different ways that we can track guest waivers. If we go back to the admin side of Court Reserve, the first option that I will show you is the waivers report that we have. So if we go to reports on the sidebar and we scroll down near the bottom of this list, we are going to have the waivers option. And on the waivers report, we are going to have two settings that are directly related to guest waivers. Of course, we can always filter by that specific waiver if you have a specific waiver that's only for guests. But if not, we can also use the only guest waivers option and the include guest waivers option when we're running this report. So if we check include guest waivers, this is going to run a report that both shows members' waivers that were signed and also guest waivers that were signed. If we check only guest waivers, no member waivers will show on this report, and we will get a report that just shows the guest waivers that have been signed. Once we run that report, we will be able to see the first and last name that was added on that guest form. We will be able to see the specific waiver that they had signed, and we will be able to see the signature and the date and the time that this guest waiver was signed as well. I will also point out that on the waivers report, if we look at the outputs, we will have some additional outputs that are related to member details like email, address, city, state, and things like that. But it will also grab that information if that information is included on your guest form. So if you want to run a report of only guest waivers and see the emails of these guests, as long as you are including or requiring email on the guest form, we can then use this output and gather all of that information when we are running this guest waiver report. The second place we will be able to take a look at any guest waivers that have been signed is going to be on the waivers and agreements page. So if we go back to settings on the sidebar and we go down to reservation settings and we go to the waivers and agreements page, this is going to be where we see the table of all the different waivers in your organization. And if we click on the plus button for any waiver, we are going to see every different version of this waiver that has ever been saved in your organization. So if you have any waiver in the system and you change the wording in any way and you make that change and you save it, you will be able to see every version of the waiver in your organization. So you will be able to see that previous waiver that you had prior to making those changes as well. But for each version of a waiver, we will be able to see how many people have signed that waiver. And if we click on the view button, this is another place where we will be able to see every signed waiver for this specific waiver type in your organization. We can click the view button and we can get some additional information here that was from that guest form. So this is another place where you will be able to find that information on signed guest waivers. All right, and that goes over how to set up guest waiver kiosks, how to push guest waivers from the front desk waiver URL, and also how to get reporting on those saved guest waivers. If you have any additional questions on this feature, always feel free to reach out to our customer success team by clicking this green button in the top right corner. That will be how you get to live support. And you can also check out our article on creating guest waiver kiosks in our knowledge base by clicking this book icon.